last week talking about the Lord of Hosts, which I can't remember, what was that in Hebrew? What, the Lord
Tobias.
Catch
me in the world.
Lord of Hosts. And I'm not sure, has anyone read Nahum cover to cover since last week? We have a hot preached on it. I was actually, if you look on, like, has anyone used the Bible app, like the YouVersion Bible app? You can put motivational text with beautiful backgrounds, and I wonder if anyone's ever put, "I'll spit you out, saith the Lord," or something like with a really beautiful background of a river or a waterfall. And I texted Mark in the middle of the week to say I was quite glad that my sermon, I think, was probably a bit easier than his, because he had so many instances of the Lord of Hosts, and he did a really good job. There's only actually in the Bible one time where God is called Jehovah Jireh, which, there's a lot of songs from one instance, because a lot of people talk about it. So we're going to find it and talk about that today. It's in Genesis 22. I'm going to read it out, but if you've got your Bibles and want to follow me, I'm reading mine from the NIV, so if yours is different, then it won't be massively different. And I'm going to call him Jehovah Jireh, although I think it's Yahweh Jireh. So I'm going to start from the beginning. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood on it. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Don't lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," Jehovah Jireh. And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." So this chapter is one that is quite well known, although I'm not quite I was trying to remember if it's in my children's Bible, I can't remember, but it's one that's really well known. And maybe sometimes we get so accustomed to it that we forget how dramatic it is, which is probably why not in some of my children's Bibles. I think, I remember watching a dramatised version once. It might have been, they had like the Bible on Channel 5, and Abraham was frantically looking for a solution whilst nervously trying to appease his God, which sometimes that's the idea we get, that God's just being a bit, mean. And is that what this passage tells us? Is it showing us that Abraham had to prove his loyalty by being willing to sacrifice his own child? It was God putting this undue burden on Abraham, and then Abraham proved it because he was scared of God? And the answer is no, by the way. But in reading, and I have found when I've looked online and read things, this passage does cause difficulty for people because it's a bit scary and it's a bit gruesome. And what was God doing? Could he have just let Abraham kill Isaac before patting him on the back and saying, "You'll have another one"? Or could he have as in Hebrews 11, the writer of Hebrews said, 19, sorry, I think. In Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews suggested that it says that Abraham believed that God could have resurrected Isaac. Richard Dawkins said that is just stress it, like he talked about how angry he was about reading it, the fact that Isaac would be scarred for life by it, emotionally scarred. But perhaps these considerations and thinking about what happened, how could it have happened, what does it tell us about Abraham and God's dynamics, perhaps they distract from the fact that at the end of it all, Abraham says, God will provide. And he called that place, God will provide. And in this sermon, I'm going to talk, it's split into two halves about Jehovah Jireh and the God who will provide. And we're going to look a bit more about the story and about Abraham and God. And this scenario is that's strange and amazing. And then also, we're going to, in the second half, we're going to talk about Jehovah Jireh and what, knowing that God is a provider, what that means for us. And how we can see Abraham as an example, and we can see God's provision, and also what we do with it. What do we do about knowing God is our provider? So, just before chapter 22, chapter 21, talks of the birth of Isaac. Abraham and Sarah had waited for him for years. It talks about God's provision of Isaac, God's provision for Abraham's servant, Hagar, and how he stopped her from dying and protected her. And as we're talking about provision, it's got that chapter about Isaac, but there are 6 chapters between God promising his provision of Isaac and Isaac turning up. That's quite a long time, it's quite a long time to read, never mind to live. And so, and in that time, Sarah forgot about God's character, took matters into her own hands, did her own thing, got Abraham to sleep with his servant, to make another baby, and did it all wrong. So, I think that by the time that Abraham called God and called that mountain Jehovah Jireh, he knew that was God's character before he was asked to take Isaac up to the mountain. He had seen God provide a child for him, he had seen God provide a land for him, and he had seen him provide favour with his enemies and with his family. He'd seen, and as he walked up the mountain, he said to Isaac, God will provide a lamb. And he also said to the servants, he'd return with Isaac. And God did provide, and the angel of the Lord then promised Abraham that he would be his descendants. God would provide him with many descendants, and his family would be a blessing to the whole earth. And we can see, that's true. That God's provision happened in God's timing, and then it continues to happen. So I think that for the things when people I've read have quibbles about maybe God's being mean, or what would God have let? Was God just testing if Abraham would have quavered? I think there was no chance of Abraham ever doing that, because he knew that God was the provider before. It wasn't this test just to see if he was good enough. The things that had happened in his life, the provision that he'd seen, and the fact that he disobeyed God, and Sarah disobeyed God, and then God had still provided for him, he knew God's character. God wasn't asking Abraham to do something that Abraham couldn't do, because Abraham knew all about God. In a second, I'm just finding myself. He wasn't testing what Abraham would do for him, like some kind of like in a control way. He was testing how much Abraham knew about him, and Abraham proved it. That word was in Abraham's heart before he even got onto the mountain. So, to summarise the passage, Abraham knew God. God knew Abraham. Abraham knew that God was the provider. And God knew that Abraham would trust him and would do what he said, so he tested him. And Abraham obeyed, which is quite still terrifying. Like the idea that God would ask me to do something even half as extreme as that, and I would trust God so implicitly, like such a challenge to me. And and God provided, not only did he provide a lamb, he provided the lamb in Jesus. Isaac never would have been enough. And God would never have expected Abraham to actually kill his own son. But God loved the world so much that he gave his son so that we can be reconciled with him. God's provision was so perfect and so complete that Isaac the boy who didn't get sacrificed, was part of Jesus' earthly lineage. And we are talking about Jehovah Jireh, because God is our provider, and He provided Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice. So now we're going on to the words Jehovah Jireh. What does that tell us? What can we say about it? Is it self-explanatory, really? God provides. Maybe I could have done a 2-word sermon and you could have gone home. But and I hope that we can all bring to mind recent stories of God's provision of finances, of material things, finances, friendships, love, healing, peace, good timing, car park spaces, and not being late for things, and things which are only maybe things that are only important to us, but God answers them, and we're amazed by it, and we realise again that He really loves us. And I hope that as you're sitting there, you can just think of things, even if they're small things. Adam's granddad died a couple of weeks ago, and Adam could tell you a whole lifetime of wonderful stories about his granddad, because he was nice before he died. Like sometimes when people die, you deify, but actually he was really good. And but God in granddad, God provided. So my dad and my granddad both died when I was young. So God provided a granddad, a perfect granddad who was absolutely beautiful. And there's no it wasn't. I don't believe it was an accident. And I could have gone on quite well without one. But God provided that, and I had for 17 years. I had a beautiful granddad, and I really, and as we've been saying to everyone, that I'm grateful for that blessing that I think God put him in my life. So, provision isn't just financial. In my Bible, and in the both translations I've read, it's Jehovah Jireh isn't God provides, it's God will provide. And I find that quite helpful, really, because it expresses longing and understanding that sometimes you might have to wait. Abraham had to wait ages to become a father to Isaac. He had to disobey, he had to learn to obey, and he still had to obey to the point of being ready to sacrifice Isaac to see God's provision. And so God will provide. So, and the word Jehovah, as Mark said last week, is Yahweh, which is I am. So God is, was, and will be. God never changes. So the never changing God will provide for us. And as Paul says in Ephesians, God is over all and through all and in all. That's not the same as saying everything is God. But that God who is over all and through all can see and can provide for us. And funnily enough, now I'm saying that about God seeing our need, the word Jireh does mean God has seen, or God will see to it. And I found that quite strange at first. I was trying to work out how those words work in my head, but our word providence comes from the Latin pro, which is before, and videre, which is to see. So provision is to see before. So it's kind of seeing above something, seeing the bigger picture, or seeing what's needed before it happens. And so God isn't just a slot machine. He's the God who sees. And Abraham was declaring that God saw and knew and provided. And I don't think, and I think he knew that already. And God saw his circumstance and saw his need. And God then, God even before then saw the need for reconciliation and freedom and salvation from sin and provided Jesus. And we've got that story of Abraham. We've got the promise of God's provision in Genesis to remind us, to show us that Jesus was the ultimate answer to the promise and ultimate provision. And we're talking about God will provide instead of God does provide. So I facetiously did a Google search to try to weed out weird doctrines related to Jehovah Jireh, you say his name 4 times. And have you ever seen them in the newspaper? People put random prayers, if you say Jehovah Jireh 4 times, then you'll get what you want. But there weren't many actually. But I did expect to see websites saying you get miraculous provision if you call God by the right name on a Saturday, and if you dial the number and gave a percentage of your earnings. But there weren't any. And we can't invoke God's name, Jehovah Jireh, to get our prayers answered. That wasn't what Abraham was saying. But, what does it mean to know the name, to know that God is our provider? How does it change our faith? How does it motivate us during the week? And how does it give us comfort and strength? And God does provide, and has provided, and will provide. And he provides because he's seen, and he has seen, and he will see to it. But I guess that's such a comfort and a reassurance. But the problem is with that for us and our human minds is that the one, Yahweh, who has seen the past and the present and the future, knows a bit more about what we need than we do. And sometimes, we find ourselves waiting, or maybe even receiving the answer, no. And that could be a challenge of provision, that we have to do what God wants to do. And what do we do if we're waiting? And I don't need to minimise it from here, because waiting for provision and feeling desperate, because, I don't think Abraham was stoic. I think, if we've got desperation, or we're sad, or we are just feeling frustrated, what do? We can look and see that Abraham and Sarah took things into their own hands, and that didn't work out very well. But then we can see that God forgave and restored them, and they were able to obey and trust God that he would provide when they did things his way. And we can understand as well God's character by studying the Bible on our own, or in church and with other Christians, and by hearing testimonies of God's goodness, and hearing and reminding ourselves of our own testimonies of God's goodness, remembering what he has done, and also by praying for our needs with other people, and by listening to other people's needs, and just remembering who God is. And if we're doing that, like Abraham and Sarah knew who God was, then they obeyed. How do we obey? Sometimes God's provision will just come as we follow him, and it can amaze us. And like in 1 Kings, there was the widow of Zarephath and Elijah. So I suppose for Elijah, really, I know there were lots of times where Elijah had to wait, but in this one, Elijah just got food. God provided food. So, sometimes God can do that and just provide for us. He said to the widow of Zarephath, please give me some food. And she did. So Elijah got food. But then sometimes we might have to be like the widow of Zarephath. She had no food. She had one bit of food left. Elijah said, give me food. And she gave him her food. And then God provided. So sometimes we are just the recipient, but sometimes we have to be obedient. We might have to sacrifice. We might just have to take a step. And how do we do that? How do we know what we have, how do we know what we're meant to be obedient with, or where we're meant to obey, what we're meant to obey? And I've been thinking about it, and didn't want to, because I think, trust and obey. But sometimes it can be really hard to know what to do, or where to go, or how to obey. And even if we know God's character, sometimes there are still questions about what's next. And as a family and as a couple, we're blessed to have a few wise friends who pray with us when we've got decisions to make. Well, just pray with us anyway, and to wait with us and feed us. And as we're waiting for provision, as we're waiting for healing or guidance or wholeness or reconciliation or peace and many other things, and telling other people about what we need just helps. And they can stand with us and pray with us. And sometimes that can be really hard because, we don't want to. Or we just think maybe we're just being, well, no, but what if I say that I've got no money and then they give me money, I'll be so embarrassed. Or what if I say that I feel lonely and then they start spending time with me, I'll be so embarrassed. But actually, telling other people about our needs and asking them to stand with us gives them a chance to work with God in providing it, or to provide wisdom and advice, and to even stand with us when provision isn't exactly what we thought it would be. As in our family, Helena and I are generally very good at finding things, and Adam and Barney aren't. And if Barney's looking for something, he'll go, Mummy! And I may roll my eyes at having to find the remote when it's next to him on the settee. That happens every day. But, it solves a problem for him. He asks for help. He asks for a solution. I do the solution. And, if he didn't do that, he'd never find the remote. He would actually never find the remote, even if it was next to him. And sometimes obedience can come in the form of sharing our needs with others and asking them to support us. And sometimes, it's a job of everyone else's responsibility to support everyone else as well. And then if we're sharing our needs with other people and still waiting, and they're praying with us and we're still not getting an idea of what it would be like, okay, I know that God's going to provide, but I can see that sometimes God asks for obedience, or maybe actually something needs to change, or I just need to do something different. I know what it is. I feel like God's telling me that something's got to change, and I just don't know what it is. What do we do? How do we obey? And I've had Abraham and Elijah, and a lot of the men in the Old Testament, to be quite bad role models for this, because they were lone rangers. They just, they did okay. Well, they're in the Bible, but they did actually do very okay. But yeah, so the women laughing at me. Look at Ruth and Naomi. They actually did things collaboratively, and I think hearing and waiting and seeing in a community, and seeing provision and rejoicing over provision and waiting over provision, and also just testing and going, I think I'm praying for this, and I think, in order, say for example, you needed to make a big change. I want God to provide me with a new job. Well, you've got to finish the other job first. But I don't know what to do. And then saying that asking for wisdom in a community is very good for us. And maybe once we've talked about it and prayed about it, maybe the next step is to do it. And he could be asking us to answer someone else's prayer by being his provision and blessing their life. He might be asking us to sacrifice something to provide change, to change something. And there isn't, as Abraham knew, it isn't because God was being a terrifying despot who wanted to cause him pain. It's because Abraham knew that God was good and that God was the provider. And whatever God asks of us, whatever we feel that God wants of us, and if we're waiting for provision, it's not because God is just being mean. It's because he is the God who provides, he is the God who sees, and he knows better than we do what is going on. And I think obeying from that position is the only real way to obey God, because if you were obeying God because you're scared of him, if Abraham was obeying God because he's scared of him, I just don't it just isn't worth writing about really. So Abraham obeyed God because he knew that God would provide. He might not have been able to tell exactly how he would provide, but he knew that he would. I am naturally quite impetuous. My mum said the other day, she's like, oh yes, out of all my children, you're the one who jumps in with both feet. So I'm not very good at waiting. I'm really not. Barney and I, Barney's got wonderful personality characteristics. It's a shame that I've just can't find anything. He's not very patient. That's just it. That's the only two. But Barney and I just aren't very patient. I don't find waiting very easy. And at the moment, we're just waiting for just God's answers to things. And, I'm in a season of waiting. And it's been going on for about 12 months. But I'm learning to be more patient, genuinely learning to be more patient. And I know we haven't been abandoned. I know that God provides. And while I'm in this place, I can look at the innumerable blessings that are already in my life while I wait. So in James 1:17, the writer reminds us that God is the Father of lights and he doesn't change. And what a beautiful way to describe Jehovah Jireh. He doesn't change. He's still God. He's still the same God that loved Abraham and loved Isaac. And he's still the same God that Abraham knew. And he will answer our prayers. Sometimes that provision might not be what we expect. And sometimes we might have to wait, or sometimes we might get called to obedience in order to see the provision, not as a test, just for the sake of it, but because God knows us. And if we know him, we are in community, and we are praying, and we are sharing it with the people in our church community, then we will be able to know what steps to take and what is next. And sometimes we just need each other while we wait. And sometimes that waiting can go on forever or for ages. Or sometimes we might have to support each other and go, well, actually, I remember, the story, someone might be going, well, you're waiting for this thing, but have you noticed that thing that's actually even better than this thing, and you haven't noticed it? And as we wait, it is important to remember that God is Jehovah Jireh. He is our provider. He never changes. And there should be a custom slide on there. Adam put a prayer on there. Yeah. So as I'm just finishing, there's a prayer I'd like us all to say, please. It's a bit longer than that, but it'll come up on this. So, yeah. So you can stand or sit or anything. Father God, thank you. Yeah, can you pray it with me, please? So start again. Father God, Thank you that we can know that you are Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who sees, the Lord who provides. Thank you that just as you provided the lamb for Abraham, you gave your son to be the perfect lamb. We acknowledge now that you are the Father of lights, and in you there is no turning. We repent for the times we have taken matters into our own hands, and we thank you for your endless grace and patience. We pray for patience, hope, and faith as we bring our needs to you. We pray for open ears, eyes, and hands as we seek to follow you, to obey you, and to bring blessing into the lives of others. We remember that you are all-powerful and loving, that you see us, and you will provide good gifts at the right time. Thank you, Lord, for your unwavering love. Amen.